Good morning, everyone. Say cheese. Good. Fantastic. Bit warm in here. So I first gave this, well, what was like a draft version of this talk at Red.Ruby conference. Like I said, I was a bit warm, so there you go. Red.Ruby conference. I got a t-shirt because I went to the conference. And as you know, I'm also quite famous online for my work for Rails documentation. Actually, could I get a microphone? Maybe easier. This is not really... Sorry. That's better. So yeah, I'm famous online for my work on Rails documentation, as well as when the slide decides it wants to go to the next slide, please. This is working well. Yeah, so I'm famous for my work on Stack Overflow. I have a high reputation there, and because of that, and because I was asking a lot of questions at the Stack Overflow meetup, I got a Stack Overflow shirt as well. So you can also know my work. This is not working. Okay, so on Stack Overflow a couple of weeks ago, there was this guy called Micah, and he asked a Rails question, and I thought, this is really cool, because he asked a really good question. I was like, okay, I'm going to answer this question. And then somehow I accidentally clicked on his profile, and if you look at his location, he lives in Madagascar. I thought it was weird, because only in Madagascar, there's Madagascar, there's only lemurs in Madagascar, right? There's no people, but Micah apparently lives in Madagascar. I thought it was amazing, right? And then there's people also who live in Ukraine, and these people got in contact with me and got me to speak at this wonderful conference called RubyC, so thank you everyone for that. Then I'm also famous because I wrote Rails 3 in action with Yehuda Katz, and I also have done Rails documentations work for the Rails guide, so I've done the Active Record Query Interface guide, the Configurations guide, and I've just started writing the Getting Started with Engines guide. So if you're looking to get into Rails engines, like from Alexi's talk, that's how you can do it. I'm also a Ruby hero, as you know already. And I'm working on a project called Forum, which is a forum application, a forum engine to be embedded inside your applications. And I can say quite clearly that it is the best Rails 3.1 forum engine ever, because it is the only Rails 3.1 forum engine ever. And I'm also working for Spree now. Cool, so that's it, that's my introduction. Beautiful, talk over. Actually, to get to this point, to get to me speaking here today, there was, of course, a beginning. So in the beginning, I was doing PHP work, and it was okay, it paid the bills, what little bills I had. And this guy called Ryan Godds and I were talking on MSN one day, and he showed me this talk by David Homer Hansen, who did this thing. He was talking about Ruby on Rails and developing a blog in 15 minutes. And that kind of got me excited. That kind of like blew my mind. And I was like, what is this magic? I wanted to get involved with it. He was talking about not doing things, and he was saying whoops a lot. I was like, wow, this is awesome. So I wanted to be awesome at Rails. And I was like, okay, there's a blog, and blogs are cool, but what else can this Rails thing do? And I got interested in doing a forum system in Rails, because that's basically the only thing I do in Rails is forum systems. And so I developed one, and that's David, by the way, if you've never met him. He's actually shorter than what he looks like in that photo. You think he's like 7 foot. But it's actually about 5'5" or something in real life. He's like this tall. But yeah, when I started writing Rails code, it looked bloody ugly. It was like this mess of wires and cable and code everywhere. It was just crap. And then I started attempting to write better code. I started looking towards getting something that's pristine and beautiful like nature. And I haven't yet got there yet. So I don't know why I'm giving this talk on how to be awesome at Rails, because I'm not yet there. So my first ever question on the Ruby on Rails IRC channel was, why am I getting undefined method fine for the thread class? Well, the number one reason for that is because I'm an idiot. The number two reason for that is because thread is already a class within Ruby, and when you load Rails, the Ruby class of thread is already loaded. So when you go to load, when you look up thread, it's going to reference the Ruby class instead of the Rails class. that I had to find. So I had to replace thread in my forum application with topic, and that made things work. This wouldn't have been possible in the Ruby on Rails community without the helpful people in the Ruby on Rails channel. So these people were like, hey, you're doing this wrong, but here, we're going to help you out and help you figure it out. So these people in the channel, and just the people who are here today, you guys are absolutely amazing because you have this helpful attitude towards everybody. Doesn't matter if they're new or if they're, if they're maybe a little bit stupid. You're actually willing to help them out. I think that's really, really amazing. So first of all, if you want to learn Rails, don't do it how I learned it. I learned it just by trying to do Rails, and I made a mess of it. So if you want to learn Rails, the first thing you want to do is to learn Ruby. How do you learn Ruby? Okay, well, you first of all have to learn to program. That's helpful. You may also have to learn, words before that. But so the Learn to Program book by Chris Pine is something that if my mum had any interest in programming whatsoever, I would get her to read that book. It's a really simple, great book to read. Past that, there's the Ruby koans. I'm not sure if the contrast looks off to me, but these Ruby koans, I used to do martial arts, and in martial arts we had things called kata. So you do a sequence of moves, and that would then improve your knowledge of that martial art. Like you do blocks, and you'd punch and kick, and whatever. Koans are exactly like kata, except they're exercises for your brain rather than your body. So the Ruby koans will actually teach you nice ways of learning Ruby. They do tests, and you improve the tests, and then they work. Then there's The Well-Grounded Rubyist by David A. Black. This is actually the sequel to the first book that I ever read for Ruby and Rails, which was called Ruby for Rails, back in 2005 or something. And he wrote this book, I think 2009, and it's really, really solid reference material for Ruby. Then once you get past learning the basics of Ruby, you can start reading books like Design Patterns in Ruby by Russ Olson here. And that teaches you the gang of 4 patterns in Ruby and really helps you improve the organization of your Ruby code. So you can't exactly wake up one day and expect to just know Rails. It just doesn't work like that. You just can't go, hey, I know Kung Fu. Just like one day you get out of bed and start working on the next version of Rails. No, it doesn't work. So what you've got to do is learn Ruby and take time and be patient with things. You're going to make mistakes. There's going to be people telling you that you're stupid. But just push through it and you'll get better every single day. And don't be afraid to admit that you're wrong. Because if you're thinking, yay, I know everything about this language, actually compared to what the universe is, I don't know about you guys. Personally, I know I can't even put my fingers close enough together before the gravitational pull of each finger. Anyway, it's so small compared to how much knowledge there is in the universe. So don't be afraid to admit that you're wrong and imperfect. It's a good trait. So after you've done learning Ruby, have a sip of water, and then learn Rails. So that's quite easy, right? If you want to be awesome at Rails, how do you be awesome at Rails? Well, you got to learn Rails. So when I got started in Rails, there weren't these things called the Rails guides. This was 2005. There were people who were writing blog articles, and then you'd read the blog articles and be like, it doesn't kind of answer my question well enough. So then these guys got together and devised the Rails guides, and these are really great resources. The Getting Started guide is my favorite ever guide book teaching material because it takes you through developing a Rails application from scratch. And it's so simple, it's so short, and it's so well written that I think it's really great. And the whole concept of the Rails guides is just amazing. If you want another free resource, there's Michael Hartle's Rails tutorial. If you saw, I think my 6th slide was the Ruby Hero Awards. He actually won a Ruby Hero Award this year along with Jonas, Darcy, myself, and other people. And he did that for Rails. He got that award for he won that award for writing Rails tutorial and a book on Rails space as well. Then, of course, there's my book, which is the best book, Rails 3 in Action, and that's just a plug for my book. And then there's these 2 other books, Agile Web Development with Rails, which is the book that you read when you're doing Rails stuff, and the Rails 3-way. And if you're interested in learning Ruby and Rails, there's this site called railsmentors.org that have a series of volunteers that will help you out, and they'll teach you about Ruby and Rails. And they're really good. And if you're already awesome at Rails, how about you volunteer your time there and maybe help out some other people? Like if you've got some time spare, go help out. Next. Thank you. So with Rails and with Ruby, like the Kung Fu slide before, you can't expect to just go from having some circles and then having this beautiful picture of an owl. It just doesn't work like that. These programming things are going to, again, take time, but if you continually practice and just say, okay, I'm going to set myself this goal. By the end of the week, I would like the forums in my application to have topics and be able to create topics out of them. If you set yourself these goals and achieve them, you get this really great feeling. Right? That's how you can continually just inspire yourself to keep going. So I've got 4 simple things I'd like to run through about how to be awesome at Rails. These are like my distilled awesome parts. And the first of these is meetups. You got to go to meetups because meetups like this conference are absolutely important. Because I went to, my first ever meetup was in this little town called Adelaide. Who's heard of Adelaide? Yeah, like the Australians and one guy back there. Okay. It's this tiny town in South Australia. It's actually the capital. I went there in 2007 and with no Ruby experience, got offered 3 jobs just out of nowhere. And so I took one of them and actually learned, I started working for a company in Adelaide, and that's how I got started in doing Ruby and Rails development professionally. If I hadn't have gone to that meetup, then I wouldn't have been learning Ruby and Rails. In the town where I'm currently living, Sydney, people know where Sydney is? Yes? Hands up? Sydney? See? This is why Sydney's a better town. Sydney is... Anyway, in Sydney, we have these meetups called the Rovo Sid events. And what happens at these meetups is just this fantastic format where people come together in a bar and they drink, which is always like, as soon as there's alcohol involved, an event just gets better. And there's this, at the beginning of the meetup, what happens is that people, whoever's running the meetup goes around the room and says, okay, whoever's new here, just put your hand up. Don't actually put your hand up now, I'm just giving a demonstration. Whoever's new here, please put your hand up and introduce yourself for 30 seconds. And at one of these meetups in September of last year, there was this girl called Matenya who put her hand up and she said she was interested in doing Ruby on Rails stuff, but she was currently working in a real estate job. And all these companies were looking for experienced developers, but she had no experience. So she was thinking, how could she get experience? She kept coming to these meetups all through September, October, November, December, April, January, February, May, January, February, March, April. Congratulations, you know your months, Ryan. So in the April meetup, she came out to me and said, guess what? And I said, I don't know, I can't read minds. And she actually got a job doing Ruby on Rails development because she actually persisted for those 6 months learning Ruby and learning Rails. And within 6 months from going, I want to do Rails, to I'm now doing Rails in just 6 months. That's really, really impressive. In Sydney, there's supposed to be text at the bottom. There's hack notes and nothing. Just a tip, if you're using a blue font, it doesn't show up on the projector screen. So in Sydney, we also have events called Action Hacks, which, we have hack nights in Sydney, and you get together and you work on problems. For the last 5 hack nights, what's happened is that we focused on the Conway's Game of Life problem. I've actually recorded a screencast on this, a 48-minute screencast, and doing the first 2 rules for that, but we try and do it in different languages. So having these meetups and coming together and working on these different problems, so we do Conway's Game of Life and we do these other problems, not necessarily in Ruby, but other languages, really improves your proficiency in those languages. Then in Brisbane, in Australia, also, sorry, I'm really thirsty, we have events called Action Hacks. Action Hacks are a less structured form of the hack nights. They happen on a Saturday, the first Saturday of every single month. And what happens is that these people get together and they work on whatever projects they want, and they share ideas and they share experiences, and it's a really fun event to attend because everyone's working together on their own projects, and it's just this really good thing. What you may not notice in this photo is that these guys are actually practicing BDD, but you just wouldn't notice it if I didn't point it out. And then there's these terrible things that come up at Action Hacks is that if you get a really tough problem, things have to get extreme, beer-driven development. All right, cool. So that's the first simple thing. The second simple thing is that leads into my first point, leads from my first point into my second point. The meetups would be nothing without people. People who go to events such as Rails Camp in Australia. These events were organized by Pat Allen, I think, and Ben Askins. Did you know? Okay, Ben did the first one. Ben Askins did the first one. Pat helped out at the second one and actually ran a game of Werewolf, which got me more involved in the Ruby community there. Just these events, you come together for 4 days. So on the Friday night, you arrive and you start drinking. And then on the Monday morning, you go back on the bus still drinking. But during that time, you're actually working on your project. So they're like a more longer version of a hack night or an Action Hack event. And you just have this great experience of being with like-minded people for 4 days in a remote location. At Rails Camp, I think it was forward, next slide. Yep, cool, too far. At Rails Camp, this is a Rails camp. So we have trestle tables, and you put your computers on them, and you have chairs, and you'll sit together, and that's really cool. But what I like about this photo is at the front of this photo, you have two people who are Ben and Kaz Askins. These are the two people who organized or helped organize the first Rails camp ever in Australia. So that's why I like this photo, because these guys are in that photo, right? And then you've got these three guys. They're further back. They're not as important, but to me they're really important. These three guys are actually new to Ruby and Rails in this photo, but when this photo was taken, they're new to it. I started teaching them Ruby on Rails and got them to attend this Rails camp, and they had a fantastic time, right? And now they're doing Rails development full time, except the guy in the middle is not doing that anymore. He's studying anthropology. Just weird, right? Rails anthropology. You think he's a nerd, but then he's actually studying people. Anyway, then there's this guy at the back, kind of almost invisible. That's Lucas. He was actually a .NET developer, and he attended his first Rails camp in Melbourne of 2009, in November of 2009. It was at Melbourne. And by the end of the weekend, he was convinced that Ruby and Rails was the best framework possible, and that .NET is just completely irrelevant now. So that's cool. Then you've got Nigel, who organizes the Brisbane meetups. So without Nigel, there would be no Brisbane meetups, or there'd just be utter chaos. So that's really cool. And then all these people in the photo that I've pointed out are people who have contributed, like we've talked or we've done something, I've done something with them. And without these people, these meetups and this Rails Camp event would be nothing. It's just being able to be around these people for any period of time is absolutely amazing. Noted, thank you. And also at Rails camps, we have to have a little bit of fun. So there's piñatas, and there's also Werewolf. This doesn't actually demonstrate what Werewolf is, but it kind of does. Because you have on the left-hand side there, you have Aaron who's saying, I'm not a werewolf. And then you have Mike, who's the third guy across, and he's saying, but I think you are. And then Aaron's going, no, I'm not. And he goes, you are too. And it's just this whole back and forth. But it's a really good way of making friends at these events. And so Rails Camp is just this fantastic event that happens every 6 months or so in Australia. It also happens in Europe. And you come together and you just work on ideas, and it's just this fantastic thing. And you drink, which, like I said before, it makes every event much better. And I try and not miss a Rails camp. That's how much I love Rails camps, is that as soon as there's a Rails camp scheduled nearby, I will go and book a ticket for it and try and get there. At one of the Rails camps, there was this guy called Alan Harper who came up to me and said, hey Ryan, I got this problem. Rails is not giving me a descriptive error message. I was like, well, that's Rails. That's what Rails does. DHH created the framework just to annoy you. It just so happens that it's a web framework and that it kind of works. So he said that this error was happening, the action new could not be found. And that's it. That's all it said. And so after dinner, when I was drunk, he approached me again and said, hey Ryan, have you got time to help out with that error message? I was like, yeah, cool. What he wanted was that this action new could not be found for projects controller, so he wanted this error message to actually appear properly and say what controller that action couldn't be found in. So we sat together and we walked through the Rails code and we found out where this error was happening and we patched it. And we actually submitted the patch to Rails, and the next day it got accepted. So we got together at Rails Camp and we worked it out and it got accepted into Rails, which is just amazing. This is Alan's first ever patch. So contributing to Rails is something that Alan wanted to do for as long as he'd been using the framework, and he actually finally got the chance to do it at Rails Camp. So that leads nicely into my third point, which is to give back to the open source community. You've been using Rails, you've been using Ruby for long enough that you think you should be able to give back to it. Well, there's actually people out there who, like me, I'll teach you how to give back to the Rails community. And I think Steve Klabnik is doing Ruby patches as well. So if you've got a Ruby patch, he'll help you get that into Ruby core, which I think is pretty cool. I also help out, so giving back doesn't necessarily have to be in patch form. You can also give back in, like, you can go to the Ruby on Rails channel, or you can help out on Stack Overflow, like you saw before. Oh, I'm still wearing it. And then I've contributed 317 commits to Rails, but that's nothing compared to people like David Heimer Hansen, who's committed, I think, 2,400 commands. But all these commits kind of work together to form this contribution back to Rails, which I think is kind of cool. My first ever patch to Rails was this patch about days a month. The days a month method was returning the wrong number of days for February of 2008. It was returning that the month had 28 days. But because it was a leap year, it should have actually had 29 days. Similar to Alan's story, there was this guy called Jeff. I was talking to this Jeff guy, and he said, why don't you submit a patch? And I said, I don't know how. So we both sat together and we worked on this patch, and it actually got into Rails. So now when you call days in month and it returns the right number of days, that's because Jeff and I got together and we patched it. Which is cool, right? And, whoops, too far. If you think Rails is too big, Ruby on Rails, see, it's big, it's too big. Funny, hilarious. If you think it's too big, there's plenty of other little projects out there. I'm working on a project at the moment called Octopi, which interacts with the version 3 of GitHub's API. So if you know some Ruby and you're interested in contributing something else back, come work with me on Octopi and we can make something really cool. Or there's other projects as well. But the point of all this working on other projects is to level up your experience. This is, wow. Who's played WoW? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I expected more. Okay, never mind. But yeah, this is WoW, where you can level up your experience. But the point of contributing back to these projects is that it's not your code, and you're making something else that's, like, you're contributing back to the greater good of some other project, which I think is just really great. Next. So while contributing back to these projects, you'll find that things that you used to do in other languages, like you'd write variables like this. And that's just wrong, because you should be writing them like this. So, and then you'll notice that that's very bad, and this is very good. So we go back, this is very bad, right? Who's written a method that looks like that, ever? On my next framework, or next whatever project, I'm going to write methods like that, and you guys are going to live through it. But then you'll learn by contributing back to these projects that writing properly in Ruby is preferred by most Ruby developers, and that for-space indenting is that just like the middle line? Is that not visible? Okay, it says for-space indenting is for pussies, and I'll actually cross out the word pussies, and underneath I'll put the word Pythonistas. So you'll know that in Ruby projects that people prefer two-space indenting and not four-space indenting. It's just the way you do things. And honestly. And putting everything does, like, I didn't like this slide when Alexei was giving his talk. I was like cringing because I saw this slide happening and yeah, then me stumbling through it like this. But putting everything in one application file may have worked in PHP, but it's not good in Ruby. So you should be separating things out. By working on these projects, you realize that the separation of concerns is your friend, and you shouldn't be afraid to if you've got a class that's operating on like doing one thing and you've got another class that's doing another thing, don't be afraid to put them in separate files, because that's just a better way of organizing your Ruby code. A great example of this is the active support library, which has a subset of it, I guess you can call it, called core extensions. And what happens in this is that we have, if we ever want to require the core extensions for the array class, we just do require active support core extensions array, and that only includes the array core extensions. If I want to get more narrower set of those methods, I can just require just active support core extensions array wrap, and that only includes the wrap method for array. Before, though, in Rails 2, you would have to do require active support, and that would require all these things. It would require all the core extensions, all the callback stuff, all the things in active support, which wasn't really good. But now in Rails 3, it's a great example of the separation of concerns. If you're looking for more information on the active support core extensions, you can read the active support core extensions guide, which I think is really helpful. Really thirsty. Anyway, and also by working with these other people, you're going to learn things like, people like TextMate, right? Who uses TextMate? Yep, cool. And then you've probably gone on to make it pretty, which is fine. And then that's cool. I'm not going to hate on you if you use TextMate. I've actually switched to MacVim just recently. But Vim is more like a fighter jet. Like you need an insane amount of training to be able to use it, but once you get up to that training level, you can like hurtle through the sky and do like barrel rolls, or I forget the other word for it, or like flips. Man, it's just amazing. Like fighter jets are amazing. And then you've got Emacs, which is more like this operating system which has editor and Tetris functionality built in for when you get bored. And then I'm not sure if I can stress this enough, but you've got to keep practicing, keep doing things again. If you've got a project and you're working on it, thank you. If you've got a project and you're working on it, and you've gone, okay, I'm quite happy with this solution. No, don't be happy with it. Don't settle. Just try and do it another way. See if you can reinvent it. So just keep doing it and see if you can refactor that code and make it better. And you've got to also experiment with your code. So you can say, okay, this works this way, but what if I used, so you may be using the HTTP party library, but what if you used a different library like Typhoeus or something like that? Okay, just try and switch out libraries and see and experiment with these things. And for the love of God, write tests. I can't, like, if I see a library and it doesn't have tests, it's like a cheesecake without chocolate. It's just wrong. Just wrong. And then you've got to experiment with services. And what I should have shown before, and I just realized now that I'm about to take off another shirt, is that Rails Camp, this is the thing that I should have shown before, you get cool t-shirts, right? So that's the meteor that's coming to crush the dinosaurs. The meteor is a Ruby, and they're coming to crush the Java.NET. And then you get this one, which is the capybara t-shirt. Jonas, you can have that one. Could you sign that for me afterwards? We got a marker. And you get this one, where people are working together and cutting a Ruby, which I think is really cool. Huh? I'm naked. Getting closer, getting closer. Yeah, so you have all these great ideas. You have all these great t-shirts at Rails camps, which is part of the reason also why I go there. But the experimentation thing is that you've got to experiment with different services. So experiment with GitHub, and you can experiment with Heroku, right? And Pivotal Tracker. Who likes that shirt? Come on, come on. It's a good shirt. That's it. All right. Almost there. So we've got 4 stages of competence, which is next. So by experimenting, you've got these, you go through the 4 stages of competence. This is like a psychological term for things. At the beginning of it, I'm pointing it, you have unconscious incompetence. It means that you're too stupid to realize that you're too stupid. That's the layman way of saying it. After that, you've got conscious incompetence. It means that you know that you're too stupid and you want to fix it, which is a good thing. That's the 2nd stage. The 3rd stage is conscious competence. You know what you're doing, but you still kind of have to think about it, right? So you may do Ruby and then you may have to go consult the API documentation, but you know where to find that API documentation. So by experimenting, you go through these 4 stages. And the 4th stage is unconscious competence, which is things like walking. Like I can walk across the stage and back without really having to think about, oh, okay, I have to put my left leg forward, right leg forward, right? Except when I'm drunk, it doesn't kind of work that way. It kind of becomes a mess. And the 4th simple thing, the 4th and final simple thing is to travel. Because if you travel, it just broadens your mind. If I ask you, name 3 modes of transportation. In Kiev, you may name like bus, car, and bike. But if I say, okay, we're on an island in Hawaii, buses, there's no buses, there's cars and there's bikes. How else do you get around? Okay, you can snorkel or you can use a boat. But by being in these different cities and around different people, it kind of shifts your mode of thinking. You're used to thinking in this one way of doing it in this city, but in another city, you'll be thinking completely different. So just travel around the world and that'll just broaden your mind. So in summary, the first thing I want you to do is go out and meet people. If you see somebody at this conference that you don't know, go up to them and ask them, hey, what are you working on? Or what's your name? Let's go for drinks, right? Because you may meet someone who's absolutely interesting and an amazing kind of person. Second thing is to absolutely share ideas with those people. Because without doing that, you're not going to be able to broaden your mind and get better at Rails. Third thing, experiment. I keep saying this, experiment, experiment, experiment. Just keep trying to do whatever it is that you want to do in a different way. And then, finally, be amazing always. Thank you, guys.